So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on this.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here, with a look at Dan Biddle. You might or might not remember, but Biddle is the jerk behind Genesis Apologetics. Now normally I wouldn't start a series of videos with such an epithet, as it poisons the well a bit. But here's the thing. Genesis Apologetics, through a proxy, has been fraudulently copyright claiming fair use of their material, not just by me, but also by Gutsick Gibbon, Vice Rhino, Godless Engineer, and Paulogia. As far as I'm concerned, that makes them jerks. Anyway, this rather low-quality video is a speech that Dan Biddle gave recently in which he says he can bring down the 10 pillars of evolution. I'm sure most of you are as surprised as I was to learn that evolution even had 10 particular pillars. But hey, who said you can't learn anything from creationists? Oh, right. Basically every scientist out there. Oh well, that's what this channel is about. Debunking nonsense. While I hopefully teach you guys something about real science while I'm at it. Anyway, without further ado, take it away, Danny boy.
Okay, so a lot of teenagers today, because you're getting crammed full of 250 pages of evolution teaching, but they have experiences with Christ, they love singing worship, they believe Christ is real, they're Christians. But when they graduate from high school, in order to try to weave and bend the evidence for evolution into their Christian worldview, they adopt theistic evolution. They believe that God created over the process of evolution over millions of years because it's their way to try to integrate the two.
And they have that in common with the vast majority of Christians. And the simple reason is that evolution is a much firmer conclusion than Christianity. I'm not here to tell you what religion to follow, but I am here to say that whatever religion you follow, if it isn't compatible with science, you've got the wrong one. Science is objectively verifiable, and subject to repeated testing and open to falsification. Yet the current leading ideas in science have yet to be falsified, despite decades and even centuries of testing in some cases. It's a simple fact that no religious idea is on the same level of footing. This isn't necessarily a problem. Much we believe in our everyday life isn't really open to that level of confidence. But still, if your theology comes first and the science second, then sorry, but your theology is almost certainly wrong. If you put science first, then your theology at least could be right.
But there's a problem with that because the special creation says that God started with the earth. Evolution said it started with the Big Bang.
Dan says this is a problem, but he's talking about theistic evolutionists, who unlike biblical literalist young earth creationists, aren't required to take the order of the Genesis account as a literal history. They can take it as the myth it is, and not have to interpret it literally. And that doesn't make it false either, because the truth of myths isn't about their literal accuracy as to the past, it's about the lessons you take from them about yourself and the world around you.
The creation order on day 2, there was water before land. Well, evolution has it the other way around, totally opposite.
Well, that's because the planet formed from accretion, and as things accrete, all their potential orbital energy gets converted into thermal energy, so planets tend to start off very, very hot. Additionally, there were more internal radioactive atoms on Earth, so the flux of radiation from Earth's interior was higher, and when radiation gets absorbed into a planet, that energy gets turned into thermal energy. You know, that whole conservation of energy thing? That also means that especially at first, Earth would have been extremely hot and screamingly radioactive. Not exactly the kind of place you'd get lots of oceans.
Day 3, you've got first life on dry land. Well, evolution says life evolved in the water.
See, this is because up until after the Cambrian, we have both land and water deposits in the sedimentary rocks of the geological record. But the only fossils we see are marine fossils. I think creationists kind of forget that we have terrestrial deposits from the Cambrian and Precambrian. Fact is, though, we do. And they don't show signs of life. Plus, being aquatic is plesiomorphic for basically every animal phylum. So we have good reason to think all extant animals originated from aquatic ancestors.
A little bit different. Sun, moon, and stars are created after the Earth, and then here in evolution, the stars and galaxies were formed before the Earth and the planets.
Well, yeah, the heavier elements require at least population 0 stars to go supernova to even exist, and to exist in any significant abundance, you're going to have to wait until higher metallicity stars occur, like population 1 or population 2. For those who aren't really familiar with these terms, let me explain. The makeup of a star is measured, at least in one way, by astronomers using a metric called metallicity. Now, mostly because they like being abstruse, astronomers, when talking about stars, call any element heavier than helium a metal, so from lithium on up. The Big Bang produced, at least as far as normal matter is concerned, almost all hydrogen with a bit of helium. As a result, the first stars had an extremely low metallicity, as there were essentially no elements besides hydrogen and helium to go into their makeup. But as we know, heavier elements up to iron are created in the cores of main sequence stars as they end their lives and explode into planetary nebulae, which have at their cores white dwarfs, neutron stars, or black holes. But this only spreads mostly elements up to iron, and a bit heavier in the case of supernovas, resulting in neutron stars or black holes. Most of the atoms heavier than iron are made in a different kind of supernova, called a Type 1a supernova. These supernovae are the result of a different kind of supernova, called Type 1a supernova. These supernovae are the result of a binary star system in which one of the companions is a white dwarf. Close orbiting white dwarfs will tend to siphon material from their companion star's atmosphere, which will then fall onto the surface of the white dwarf. Of course, this raises the mass of the white dwarf, and when it is close to what is called the Chandrasekhar limit, which is the mass at which the structure can no longer hold its own weight as normal matter, and if it were to get heavier, it would collapse into a neutron star held up by the Pauli exclusion principle, it will hit the energy required for iron fusion, which will then, in a fraction of a second, fuse essentially all of the accreted material into heavier elements and throw them off in a characteristic explosion that has a consistent brightness, and which sees the surrounding space with a virtual menagerie of heavy elements. As a side note, the consistent brightness of these supernovae allow them to be used as measures of distance to distant galaxies in which they observed, making them one of our best standard candles. Anyway, it took some Type 1 supernovae from pop-0 low metallicity stars to get to the point where we could even have enough heavy elements to form a planet. So stars and galaxies logically had to precede a planet like Earth, since Earth is essentially made out of the detritus of dead stars.
Day 5, you've got birds before dinosaurs. Well, evolution says dinosaurs became birds.
Well, one lineage became birds, the rest died out. It's not like all dinosaurs gradually evolved into becoming birds independently. That would actually go a long way to falsifying evolution if it had occurred. But why does science conclude that birds evolved from dinosaurs? Because birds meet every anatomical definition of dinosaurs. See the videos linked above and in the description for a more in-depth dive. But further, birds evolved in the Middle Jurassic, depending on exactly how you want to define bird. And the first dinosaurs we have on record come from the late Triassic. So yeah, we know for a fact that birds came after the first dinosaurs, for the same reason we know your great-grandparents were born before your first cousins.
And by the way, that's a relatively new idea. I certainly never heard about that when I was
Not really. It was floated as an idea during Darwin's time, and in fact Archaeopteryx was initially heralded by much of the scientific community as the link between birds and dinosaurs. It was to a large degree Richard Owen's attempts to dismiss the idea that made it lose favor for a while, but with the discovery of dinosaurs like Deinonychus, it was once again brought into the limelight, and with repeated new finds that do nothing but support the hypothesis that birds are dinosaurs and fail to support the null hypothesis that they are anything else, there is at this point no longer any reason to doubt that birds are dinosaurs, no matter what hacks like Alan Fiducia, who have taken themselves outside the bounds of science, might like to say.
But now when you go to these big dinosaur shows all over the place, they're sticking feathers on every dinosaur every which way all over the place. So they basically turn them into large talking chickens there. So,
other than parrots and sometimes ravens and crows, I'm not really aware of any popular depictions of dinosaurs that aren't overly anthropomorphic, such as, in The Land Before Time, talking. But whatever, let's focus on feathers. First, I want to explain a technique in reconstructing extinct taxa called phylogenetic bracketing. So in this you see which characteristics are most widely distributed in a group of organisms. Let's take mammals, for example. You find fur in monotremes, marsupials, and placental mammals, and only the occasional exception within that group, such as elephants, whippomorpha, naked mole rats, and to some degree humans. So if you find a new fossil mammal, the safe bet is that it has fur, as it is the basal and most widespread trait in the group of organisms to which it belongs. But what if the animal is in fact a fossil cetacean? Well, now you have to see where it falls. All modern cetaceans lack any appreciable fur, so if it is within crowned cetaceans, that is, it is more closely related to some living cetacean than to another living cetacean, it makes sense to not reconstruct it with fur. Whereas if it is basal to modern cetaceans, you have to consider its habitat and lifestyle, because we know that some basal whippomorph-like animals must have had fur, as fur is the basal trait for mammals. So now we can see how this applies to feathers and dinosaurs. There are some 50 plus dinosaur genera for which direct evidence of feathers is known. This list is always growing as new discoveries are being made. Now we know from skeletal evidence that animals in Deinonychosauria, for example, are closer to birds than they are to other dinosaurs like ornithomimids, and we have direct evidence that birds have feathers, and that some Deinonychosaurs did too, such as Maniraptor gui and Velociraptor, which have been found with feather impressions and quill knobs respectively. So let's say we have a taxon that is phylogenetically within the group that includes Deinonychosauria and aves, that is, paravians. Let's say it's Troodon, and we don't have any direct evidence that it was feathered. Well, since feathers appear to be the basal condition in paraves, and this is a paravian dinosaur, the most likely option is that Troodon was covered in feathers. And as it turns out, feathers and related structures are basically ubiquitous throughout Dinosauria to various degrees, but might even be common to Ornithodiro, the group that includes pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and their most recent common ancestor and all of its descendants. Now, these are not always feathers the way you think of them. For example, most ornithischian feathers, like those of Psittacosaurus or Colindrodromeus, were not much like those of modern birds, but they still share some key features with them that make us call them proto-feathers.
And then on day 6, we've got man created in God's image from dust. And in evolution, man is made in animal likeness from ape-like creatures. So the Bible says we're made in the image of God, not in the image of apes.
While humans are definitely multicellular eukaryotes with an internal digestive tract, and they also have other features unique to animals, like being held together largely with collagen, so humans are certainly animals no matter how they came about. So if we're talking about the physical form of humans, then the question is why the eternal pre-existing creator of the world is an animal. Could it be perhaps that the Imago Dei is more of a matter of reasoning, creative capacity, and moral agency than it is that God happens to be a sweaty bald monkey? I don't know, just food for thought. But speaking of sweaty bald monkeys, before we continue, I'd like to take a moment to thank my patrons and channel members. I just want to take a second to thank my channel members and patrons, especially those pledging $20 and above. Bob Knob, Benthoven, Ian Chen, Chris Love, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, Patrick Dennis, and Res Instance. My channel members and patrons help make this channel possible, and without their support, this channel really wouldn't exist. If you would like to help support the channel as a member or patron, there are links in the description to both join the channel as well as join the Patreon. Patrons and members get mentioned in these credit scenes, as well as getting early access to my scripted videos, and if you pledge $10 or above, you can also get access to various 3D assets that I create for Blender, both for use in the channel, as well as just general giveaways to my supporters to help in any Blender projects they might have. If a monthly or annual pledge isn't for you, then there is also a merch store linked to the description, and if none of that's right for you, please just like and subscribe because every like and subscription really helps the video out. Thank you.
So this is the poison that the kids are adopting. And then they get to the creation account and they're like, well, that must be myth and fairy tale. And if that's myth and fairy tale...
Well, it's a myth because it exists to give people a context for their relationship to God, nature, and each other. But it does that regardless of its literal truth. The point of myths isn't that they happened, it's that they tell us something about ourselves and our world that isn't dependent on historical accuracy. It's kind of like a fable or a parable. In Jesus' parable of the rich man and Lazarus, it's not important if the rich man is a real person, and he almost certainly was not. Similarly, in the story of the scorpion and the frog, the fact that we know that frogs and scorpions don't talk, never mind to each other, isn't important. Both stories have a lesson to give us. So does the creation myth of Genesis. Now, I'm not going to tell you if you should accept that lesson, but it's clearly there no matter how you take the historicity of the story.
Why do I need to submit to anything else the Bible says?
You don't, I guess. At least not if you don't want to. But if you do, the idea that the whole collection of separate works depends on the literal truth of one section of one book that doesn't even have a single author seems a bit odd to me as someone with training in the historical method.
So let's look at teaching in evolution, the evolution teaching in school. So this talk is titled Debunking the 10 Pillars of Evolution, but it's really modeled over the template of the evolution that's taught in public schools.
So I guess these aren't really pillars of evolution then. That's a bit too bad. But then again, I do get the idea of using the parts of evolution that are most commonly taught in order to criticize it to a lay audience.
So if you were to take all the public school textbooks that talk about evolution, they're going to boil it down to these 10 things.
It's been a while since I was in grade school, but I sure hope the public education isn't so wanting in schools that they boil evolution down into just 10 things. Evolution is a body of knowledge over a century old, with tens of thousands at least of supporting studies, papers, etc. 10 points would be a severe paucity in terms of the evidence for evolution.
Deep time, which is the foundation for their whole theory. It all requires deep time. Then they've got human evolution.
I mean, human evolution is a neat example, but even if we only had extant apes and no fossils, it would be a certainty. Or as close to one as science gets. But it's not like if we didn't know anything about human evolution, we would give up evolution as a whole. It's far too well evidenced for that.
Adaptation, natural selection, fossils.
I mean, fossils, as much as I love them, are the icing on the cake. The morphology and genetics of just extant species is enough to conclusively dismiss special creation. simply because of the twin-nested hierarchy, which demonstrates quite conclusively that there is common ancestry. This is because human-made objects don't fall into objectively nested hierarchies, because designers can swap out parts. For example, the lug nuts from two different makes of cars with different designers may fit both cars. This is because the lug nuts are a standard part that can be swapped out entirely without any ancestry. On a more extreme scale, you could power two entirely different vehicles from the same combustion engine, a propeller plane and a car, for example. In Descent with Modification, the entire organism is modified, and so each new clade contains adaptations and changes which are unique to it in all of the animal kingdom. That is why, to cite a famous example, despite the fact that 4 lineages have developed powered flight, that is, insects, pterosaurs, bats, and birds, their wings are all different. A common designer can mix and match parts. He could make a chimera, as human designers can and do. In fact, it's easy to see that a chimera would in many cases perform better. For example, bats benefit from the keen hearing of mammals, but would do even better with the keeled sternum and lungs of birds, yet they lack them. Because they're stuck with what evolution gave them, mammal bodies through and through. The fact that genetics follows essentially the same pattern of nesting that anatomy does, even in neutral variation, is confirmation that takes the statistical significance of this matter beyond any reasonable doubt. There is no reason besides common ancestry for even the neutral variation between organisms to fall into the same nested pattern as morphology of those organisms.
Common ancestors, homological structures, vestigial structures, or leftover structures.
I mean, the fact that these exist at all is really only explained by evolution, so I guess I might call these pillars of evolution, especially common ancestors, since one of the main ideas in evolution is common ancestry, and conveniently, we know that groups of organisms have common ancestors.
Whale evolution.
Whale evolution, like human evolution, is more of a nice example than a pillar. It's kind of like saying that the orbit of Jupiter is a pillar of Kepler's laws of planetary motion. By itself, it's more of an illustrative example. It's the broad accuracy of the laws across virtually all orbiting bodies that is the basis for accepting them as general rules, although they do break down at certain scales, and you have to use Einstein instead of Kepler. Similarly, evolution in no way rests in particular on whales. It's just that we have a nice series of fossils and genetics to back it up. So we have a really clear picture of their evolution when compared to some other groups.
And extinction.
Excuse me, the f did you just say?
Extinction isn't a pillar of evolution. It's not even really required in order for evolution to work. It's just a fact of the world, and so our accounts of the history of life take it into account.
These are really the 10 pillars that the kids are getting inundated with today. It used to be starting in 5th grade, now they've rolled it back to 3rd grade, so they're starting even earlier.
Good. It's never too early for kids to get exposed to science, as long as the content is tailored to their age. And I'm sorry, but the fact that his particular version of Christianity is contradicted by basic reality isn't a good reason to not expose kids to reality. When your religion is on the same footing as flat Earth, I have no desire to pander to it or the feelings of its adherents. Get a better theology, and quit whining that kids are taught science.
Let's deal with the first pillar, the age of the Earth and radiometric dating. So you've got to ask yourself the question, why does the world push millions of years? Well, the answer is pretty simple.
The world isn't pushing millions of years any more than it's pushing the germ theory of disease, universal gravitation, the heliocentric solar system, atomic theory, cellular theory, or the globe-shaped Earth. It's just that when you want to take reality seriously, you have to take the evidence as it presents itself, and it is conclusive that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. It's not an agenda, it's just the conclusion of science. The fact that Dan Biddle doesn't like it doesn't make it a conspiracy to make him lose his faith.
Because there's this doctrine that fundamental Christians hold to called special creation.
Nope, science is not done to contradict some theological position. Creationism basically doesn't come up in science except in a few papers that occasionally exist basically to poke fun at how absurd it is. The serious work of science continues on, barely even aware that creationists still exist. In fact, often completely unaware of them. And that's because they are as relevant to science as alchemists are to chemistry, or astrologers are to astronomy. They are a quaint historical curiosity, and the fact that they still exist is likely to elicit little more than a bemused chuckle from actual working scientists. The fact that science contradicts special creation isn't a matter of malice or conspiracy. It's simply the fact of the matter.
Which means, in fact, I was just at a church recently, and I asked all the kids, I said, how did God create? What were the mechanisms that God used? And it was crickets. Nobody knew.
That's a fair response, since we didn't really get a mechanism that can be described in any scientific way from the Bible.
The mechanism is really simple. He spoke it. over and over and over again. And there was light, there was evening, morning, day 2, and then God said, and then God said, and then God said. And all through Psalms and Isaiah, it talks about God commanded and it stood firm.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
Speaking isn't a mechanism. Because, one, before air, how did God speak anything? So even if we take the story literally, it had to be a metaphor when he speaks. Second, we know that speaking doesn't affect creation. So we had to be actually literally doing something more than just speaking. This is the problem with literalism. It leads to contradictions even within a basic text that you just don't have to assume are there. You can just let the narrative have its allegory and metaphor, and at least then it's internally consistent for the most part. Or you can be Dan Biddle and take the worst possible take on it and make the whole thing fall apart on verse 3.
So if you don't want to agree in the special creation that God miraculously spoke into existence, you got to have something stretched out over millions and millions of years so it could come into place randomly.
Well, that's a false dichotomy if I ever heard one. Either it's literal speech, which is impossible, or it's randomness over a long term, which isn't even what science says. It's a false dichotomy where both options are nonsense. That's one for the record books. At least most false dichotomies are between two things that are somewhat internally consistent.
So over and over the place, you look on TV, you go to natural history museums, you can't even take a bike ride around Lake Natomas without seeing signs of millions of years.
It's in movies, it's on TV. You can't even take a look at a map without seeing signs of the round Earth. Yeah, there's a reason for that. It's because the big difference between believing in a young Earth and a flat Earth is just how long we've known you're wrong. There's still no conspiracy against the young or the flat Earth. It's just people going about their business accepting the obvious nature of reality that is glaringly clear to all but the duped or deliberately ignorant. And if you're a creationist, you're either misinformed, dishonest, or both.
It's everywhere. Kids are steeped with it.
Yeah, just like they're steeped in universal gravitation. No one is going to make a show that pretends that gravity just doesn't work in general, because everyone would have trouble taking it seriously. The fact that some small, misinformed segment of the population doesn't like that isn't going to change it.
And they know that it has to be fundamental to the idea of evolution. Here's a clip from a high school biology book that says this. Evolution takes a long time. If life has evolved, then Earth must be very old. Hutton and Lyell, which were two geologists of the 1800s, argued that Earth was indeed very old. But, interesting, did you know that these guys said that they wanted to free geology from Moses?
First, that's an ad hominem argument. Don't trust these guys because they said a naughty thing about Moses. Guess what? If they had said that they wanted to burn all the Bibles and sacrifice babies to the ancient Earth by throwing them in volcanoes, and then they wanted to eat all of the Christians, that wouldn't make them wrong. Second, who cares what Hutton and Lyell thought? They are of significance to the history of science, but no longer to the science itself. Science isn't about great profits the way religion often is. The words of Hutton and Lyell aren't sacred. They are simply the first to spread certain ideas which turned out to be broadly correct. And so we remember their names.
That was their goal. They wanted to take geology out of the context from Moses and the genealogy and free it up to the idea of uniformitarianism or deep time.
They sure did, but if they had been wrong about deep time, they wouldn't have been able to win the fight. Turns out, they were right, and the Earth is old. And so they did free geology from pretending that rocks of the Earth were largely the result of the flood, and then just not bothering to look more into it. Hooray for Hutton and Lyell.
So he goes on and says that they argued that the Earth was indeed very old, but technology in their day couldn't determine just how old. Half a century after Darwin published his theory, however, physicists discovered radioactivity. Geologists now use radioactivity to establish the age of certain rocks and fossils. This kind of data could have shown that Earth is young. If that had happened, Darwin's ideas would have been refuted and abandoned.
It's almost like there wasn't some sinister conspiracy to prove Darwin correct.
So the battle line is drawn. So, these are all 10, let me see, this is just 4 of the books that talk about biology. These books are 1,000 pages long. Most of them include 150 pages of evolution teaching. 1/8 of these textbooks deal with evolution. So these kids are just getting drowned in it, lots and lots. So
I would argue that's far too little. Now, not every page should be exclusively concerned with evolutionary mechanisms, but evolution should be on every page of a biology text. To a certain extent, evolution is biology. Missing it out would be like trying to talk about the weather and not bothering with humidity or barometric pressure. Sure, I guess you could talk about the weather without those two, but if you're trying to teach people about it, they're kind of important. Similarly, evolution is a unifying theory in biology. As Theodosius Dobzhansky, a Christian mind you, once said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." But I think I will leave you with those wonderful words from Dr. Dobzhansky. Don't worry, there's a whole lot more of this to go. We're only barely through 1/5 of it. Before you go, please make sure you subscribe to this channel if you aren't already, and hit the like button if you liked the video, or if you didn't like it, hit the dislike button and tell me why you didn't like it in the comments. If you do subscribe, make sure you hit the bell icon and turn on all notifications so you're always notified when there's more Dapper Dino content. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.